This is my favorite hobby, listening to shortwave radio. But what exactly is short? There are actually two parts to the answer. The first part is pretty easy. Shortwave is simply any radio broadcast between roughly 3 and 30 megahertz. That's a lot of spectrum. But for most listeners, unless they have a massive antenna array or are a military installation, they won't be able to pick up anything below 7 megahertz. And even for those with large antennas, reception below 7 megahertz is still very difficult. So for most shortwave listeners, shortwave really starts at 7 megahertz. But there is no official start or end to the shortwave band. It just kind of ends where other radio bands begin. And now for the second part of the answer, which is a bit more complicated, but also makes shortwave such a unique medium. Shortwave isn't just a band of frequencies, it's also a propagation mode. Basically, the way the frequencies in this band behave is quite different from lower frequencies like AM radio. Higher frequencies like VHF-FM radio can't travel as far because they're just too darned high up in the frequency domain. Shortwave frequencies, though, are high enough to avoid most of the stuff on the lower frequencies, like AM radio stations and interference noise, and yet they can still be picked up hundreds if not thousands of miles away. You see, shortwave frequencies bounce off the ionosphere and can cover huge distances. This is why a lot of international broadcasters use shortwave to reach their audiences. Some of the biggest names in long-range broadcasting are Radio Moscow, the BBC World Service, and the Voice of America, plus China Radio International. While these are all run by governments, they're not associated with any particular country's military. They're what we call in the US civilian government agencies. In the case of Radio Moscow, that was part of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The BBC World Service and the Voice of America are run out of the British and American foreign ministries respectively. These stations aren't like your typical radio stations that play music and commercials. Rather, they only broadcast news in either their native language or English. There's typically multiple broadcasts throughout the day for each station, and each broadcast is usually about an hour long. All of these broadcast stations, along with many others like them, have one main purpose: to spread news about their respective countries to the rest of the world. And thanks to shortwave, they can do this extremely cheaply, while reaching millions of people. The major downside is that because these stations are run by governments, they often get shut down during times of conflict. During the Cold War, both the US and USSR would jam each other's broadcasts with high-power transmitters. The Voice of America was completely shut down after the terrorist attacks of September 2001, which was very unfortunate because they had just upgraded their transmitter infrastructure a few years prior. And during the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011, broadcasts from both Radio Free Asia and Radio Liberty were jammed almost constantly. Despite this, shortwave remains an extremely important tool for spreading information around the globe, especially when you consider how cheap it is compared to other methods of information dissemination. Not only does shortwave allow these stations to reach millions of people without expensive satellites or fiber optic cables, but once the initial investment of the transmitter is made, the operating costs are minimal. Compare this to something like satellite television, which has to replace its satellites every few years at a cost of tens of millions of dollars. It's no wonder why so many countries still use shortwave to broadcast their message. But there's another type of shortwave listener who doesn't just listen to these broadcasts. Instead, he listens to what's called long-range amateur radio. The term amateur radio refers to people who hold an amateur radio license, essentially giving them permission to construct and own and operate radio equipment below a certain prescribed power depending on license class. In the United States, you can get an amateur radio license from the FCC. the Federal Communications Commission. In the UK, the RSGB and Ofcom. As I mentioned earlier, it's pretty unlikely that you'll be able to pick up anything below 7 MHz, but there are exceptions. The long-range enthusiasts who pick up HF signals are probably using a long-wire antenna. Simple physics. One of the best aerials for picking up high-frequency broadcasts is a long wire, connected via a balanced to unbalanced transformer to coaxial feed line into your shortwave set. This setup allows you to tap into the broadcast without introducing common mode noise. Common mode noise is any electrical interference that appears on both sides of the signal feeder cable. When you're picking up a broadcast with a traditional antenna, it is typically not an issue because the interference will appear on both sides of the antenna and thus be rejected by the receiver. But if you have a long wire antenna connected to an unbalanced port, then this isn't true anymore. Any common mode noise will make its way straight into the receiver. The solution is to feed the antenna with a balanced line like ladder line, which has two separate conductors, one for each leg of a wire dipole and another conductor to earth. By grounding the outer shield of an unbalanced aerial feed line at the receiver and connecting the inner conductor at the antenna, it's possible to eliminate almost all common mode noise with simplicity compared to balanced ladder line. But with a impaired performance, plenty of different ways to do things really, including external preamp. Aerials are a good place to start. Research a balanced to unbalanced transformer is a neat trick too, with a long wire. A very good solution to noise these days is web interfaced optimal HF receivers, and no extra outlay. Speaking of which, one of the best radios for picking up low frequencies is the Texan Peel Katigara Sapulo. It's got a ferrite bar antenna built into the radio, which works surprisingly well at picking up shortwave broadcasts, even at low frequencies. It's also got a synchronous detector, which helps it pick up stations that are being heavily modulated or even those that might be drifting slightly off frequency. So if you want to try picking up HF broadcasts, a Texan PL310 is a great radio to get. For amateur radio too, a Texan PL600 has the capability. Just make sure you add some sort of external antenna. But if you want the best chance of picking up shortwave stations, then you'll need a long wire antenna. As I said before, the best type of antenna for picking up high frequency, i.e. shortwave broadcasts, is a long wire fed with a balanced line. The length of the wire isn't super critical, but it should be at least 100 feet, if not more. If you can find an area with less electrical noise and set up the long wire antenna far away from your house, you'll have a much better chance of picking up weak signals like amateur QRP contacts. It takes a bit of effort, but it's absolutely not impossible to pick up amateurs on If you're willing to experiment a bit with your antenna, then it's possible that you can hear all sorts of awesome stuff on Thanks to shortwave, anyone with a basic understanding of electronics can broadcast to millions of people around the world. Whether you're trying to hear the latest news from CRI, or maybe pick up an underground rebel station, shortwave can bring the world to your ears. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out the next one. Until next time, 73 from Amateur Station G8OZD.